Good afternoon. So these two monks go into a forest. No, that's not. Actually, there's a story about an older and a younger monk who are traveling together, and they show up at this river that has a very strong current. And as they begin to cross, they notice that there's this very beautiful woman also wants to cross, and she's crying. And she comes up to them and she's like, "I'm sorry, could you please help me to cross to the other side?" The two monks glanced at each other because they had taken a vow not to touch women. So, without a word, the older monk picks her up, carries her across the river, gently places her down on the other side, and he continues walking. The younger monk couldn't believe what happened. He was so incensed. But he didn't say a word as they continued walking on their journey. An hour passed. Another hour passed. More hours passed, and they're walking in silence, and he's just getting more angry and more angry. Finally, he can't take it anymore, and he turns to the older monk and he says, "I can't believe what you did back there. We took a vow. As monks, we are not permitted women. How could you then carry that woman on your shoulders?" So the older monk looks at him and he replied, "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river. Why are you still carrying her?" Negative feelings, they stay with us for a very long time. Think about people that you're still mad at for something that they did years ago. Or think about how perplexed you are when someone is angry at you or continues to be angry at you after you've tried to make amends or tried to appease them by doing something kind for them, but all they remember is that one time you did not treat them with kindness. Or think about the time someone came up to you and said they were sorry, and you accepted it and you forgave them, but you didn't forget. Human beings have a tendency to have a negative bias. This has been studied for decades. Author Kendra Cherry writes, "Studies have shown that when given both good and bad adjectives to describe another person's character, participants give greater weight to the bad descriptors when forming a first impression." This negative bias that draws us to the negative literally entering into our souls. Jordan Chitley, a writer for the Center for Journalism Ethics, writes, quote, "I found that negative news does have an impact on people's level of optimism and happiness. The more negative news participants watched, the more their optimism level decreased, and the more likely they were to feel sad or frightened or afraid or tense." I guess the next question is, has anyone here read any negative news lately? This year we've been emphasizing, talking about kindness. And I can't help but feel like this tendency we have to be enamored with the negative is part of the reason why we're not as kind to each other as we would actually like to be. One of the most important values stressed in Judaism feels like it's designed to combat our negative bias. It comes from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Sages. Rabbi Joshua ben Prachia, he writes, "Dan et kol ha'adam lechaf zechut." Judge every person to a scale of merit, or judge other people favorably. The shortened version is dan lechaf zechut, or you could just say lechaf zechut. And I'm really sorry, I would have preferred to have a phrase that you could say that doesn't have a lot of chuz and fuzz and all that. It's hard to say. We're going to say it together, okay? Let's just try lechaf zechut. Lechaf zechut. You will be tested on this afterward. So usually this is translated as giving someone the benefit of the doubt. But I don't like that word doubt, so I'm not going to use that when I translate it. I want to use the phrase judge favorably. It's active, it's a positive suggestion, and I do believe that it is the intention of the phrase dan kol ha'adam lechaf zechut. It's the idea of bringing about kindness to other people. Later, the rabbis in the Talmud, in Shabbat, go even further. They state, one who judges another favorably will be judged favorably by God. And then they have these two incredibly long stories about people who make favorable assumptions about a person, and then God, of course, does grant them whatever they needed. Again, it's Jewish tradition emphasizing that positive action and positive thought leads positivity back in our direction. Rabbi Hillel offers another way of approaching Dan Lechaf Zechut in Pirkei Avot. Again, in 2:5, he says, don't judge your friend until you put yourself in his place. The Bartanura, which is a commentary from the Middle Ages, expounds on this Mishnah, and it says, if you see your neighbor ensnared by some temptation, do not judge your neighbor harshly until you have faced the same temptation and mastered it. The more I thought about this concept about judging people favorably, the more I realized that the act in itself is kindness. It is a kind act because it is based upon the idea that humanity is inherently good, people want to do good, and that each person, no matter who they are, has goodness inside of them. Reb Nachman of Breslov, I realized in all of our sermons we've mentioned Reb Nachman of Breslov. He says finding goodness inside, and he assumes that there is goodness in there, can help actually change people. Quote, you have to judge every person generously. Even if you have reason to think that the person is completely wicked, it's your job to look hard and seek out some bit of goodness. Some place in that person where they are not evil. And everyone, after all, has such a place. And by telling them, showing them that that's who they are, we can help them change their lives. Judging others favorably, it's an attitude adjustment. And it can affect so much of the way we go about our lives. Think about this. If we consider the actions of others favorably, no need to gossip. No need to do Lashon Hara. If we take a positive outlook as to why someone might have done something, maybe we won't be angry at them. Or maybe we won't act harshly towards them. If we put ourselves in their shoes and we think about what we would do or not do, or even what we did or didn't do in the exact situation, we might have more compassion on other people. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement 300 years ago, he connects even our critiques of others as containing a sense of judging favorably. Because he said that only when we were with others can we know our own faults. He says, quote, by observing the acts that they dislike in another person, they see their own defects as in a mirror. They would not have been given the opportunity to note their friend's offense if they had not been unconsciously guilty to some degree of the same exact offense. For the Baal Shem, the negative impulse and critique of others is actually a critique of what we don't like about ourselves. It's like that well-known phrase about pointing. When you point a finger at someone else, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. Right? And then let's think about those 3 fingers for a second, because this whole concept of judging others favorably, it includes you. It's also about me. Rev Nachman suggests, so now, my clever friend, now that you know how to treat the wicked and find some bit of good in them, now go do it for yourself as well. Just as difficult, if not more difficult, is judging yourself favorably. The whole point of this time of the year is to notice our imperfections, notice our worst moments, notice where we are not good people. But within that, we have to have a base understanding that we are good, generally. How can we see good in others if we have such a hard time seeing good in ourselves? And how can we ask for forgiveness and expect to get it when we aren't able to forgive ourselves? So although what I'm talking about right now about yourself and judging yourself favorably and forgiving yourself is just one little paragraph, in ways it's as important as this entire speech. Because we must begin by judging ourselves favorably. And that may be the hardest thing that we have to do today. Another big question I feel lingers in the air is, what if someone is just completely evil, awful person, someone who's known to be evil, and they do something that's questionable? I know that's what all of you were thinking. Well, in fact, Maimonides and others say that we're actually not required to completely judge them favorably. We don't have to. Although I think Nachman would disagree, and he would probably argue that all people, even those that we think are horrible, all those people have at least a little dot of goodness that we could find. But I would say that when I talk about these kind of human behavioral concepts, I'm not talking about the extremes on both sides. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about everyone in this room. People just pursuing life to the best of our ability. People trying, at least, to live lives with love and goodness and kindness. I know we aren't perfect. That's why we're here. We all recognize that we have faults. To judge every person favorably shows that we understand that people make mistakes, that we understand that there are reasons why people do things. And I may not agree with every action that somebody does, but the fact is, we don't know why people do what they do. There's a famous story in Samuel 1 about Hannah, who was a woman who was childless, and she came before the Holy Temple at Shiloh to offer prayers at the altar where the Ark of the Covenant was, and she was hoping that she could get pregnant by praying to God. And so the high priest Eli is just observing Hannah, who was praying from her heart and praying so deeply, and all she was doing was moving her lips, but she wasn't making a sound. And Eli looks at that and thinks she's drunk. And he says to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." And Hannah replied that she hadn't been drinking. She was pouring out her soul to God so she would have a child. After realizing that he had prejudged her in a negative and inaccurate way, Eli blesses Hannah with the words, "Lechi l'shalom," go in peace. It's interesting that in the Talmud's commentary about this exact scene, we learn from Rabbi Elazar. From this we learn that those who suspect their fellow human beings of a fault which they have not committed must beg their forgiveness. And that's not all. They must also bless them. As Eli said to Hannah, "Lechi l'shalom," now go in peace. For me, this is one of the most important messages of Dan L'chaf Zechut. I don't know your story. You don't know my story. Every time we come in contact with somebody, we may not have any idea what literally just happened to them right before we saw them, or what happened to them this morning, or what happened to them last night, or last week, or last month. Think about all the times that, there's someone you knew pretty well and they were acting a little off, and you're like, "Hey, what happened to blah, blah, blah?" And they tell you what happened, and then you realize, "Oh, now I understand exactly why they acted the way they acted." If Eli had been told that Hannah was heartbroken because she couldn't have children, and that's why she was there to pray, there's no way that he would have misunderstood what she was doing. So consider now all that Judaism teaches concerning this idea, Dan L'chaf Zechut, judge people favorably. We've learned that when we judge others favorably, God judges us favorably. It allows us to reflect on what we ourselves might do in the same situation, or actually, it might even make us refrain from judging if we've never been in the situation that the person's in. We learn that the faults we see in others may just be actually the faults we see in ourselves. But most importantly, it helps us to look at the world with this positive outlook, with permission to search for a spark of goodness, even if it's this tiny, tiny little dot of goodness inside other people. Finally, I want to end with this one interpretation from the Sfat Emet, who lived about 200 years ago. And it feels to me like he kind of rolls it up into one idea. He sees the words, Kol Ha'adam, right? It's Dan Kol Ha'adam L'chaf Zechut. Kol Ha'adam, he doesn't translate the way I've been translating it as people or every person. I've been saying that. He says, Kol Ha'adam, kol is all of, as in all of a person. When we judge someone, we must look at the whole human being, the entire personality. As he wrote, quote, "For even if this specific thing they did was not kosher, it's conceivable that they have other qualities or merits that counterbalance that evil that you see in them." Let us all look at each other as not one action, not one thing, but as complete human beings. Let us look at all of the person when we think about what they've done, in order to find sparks of goodness and kindness inside of them. Let us dan kol ha'adam l'chaf zechut. Let us judge a whole person, not just an action, not just one aspect of a person, with a scale of favorable kindness. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will.